question that often gets asked, aren't there enough nonprofits? And why should you start another one? And so I'm just pointing out here that in the area of the Austin Community College District, there are about 6,000 nonprofits, and most of them are sitting in Travis County. But more important than this slide, okay, why are we not? Okay, is this slide here, which shows that the vast majority of nonprofits are pretty small. As you can see, if we look at this line here, that 70, 85, 86% of all nonprofits have gross revenues of less than $1 million. A whopping 78% have gross revenue of less than $500,000. And there isn't much that one can do. Well, one could do a lot, I guess, but there isn't much staff that one could have on board with that size. So the vast majority of nonprofits are, as you can see, relatively small. As you can see, only less than 1,100 nonprofits have gross revenues more than $10 million. There are about 340,000 people who work in nonprofits in the state of Texas. And so you have a sense of the sector. It's made up of the vast majority of small organizations who have the same kinds of responsibilities and requirements as do larger organizations. So our goal in this webinar, as well as in the work that we do at the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College, is to help create and sustain effective nonprofits. While our work is restricted to Central Texas, we are certainly open to any questions that may come from outside of the district. The focus is on effective. Effective being having a clear sense of what it is you want to achieve, acquiring the means and the assets to make it happen, making it happen, and then also stepping back and reflecting on it. I prefer not to speak in terms of best practices because best practices are usually derived from very large organizations, and what's good for them or possible for them is often not possible or even good for smaller nonprofits. An effective An effective nonprofit, as you can see on this slide, has clear values, a vision and mission, and effectively communicates them. Values are what you believe that gets you started in this enterprise in the first place, like the dignity of all people, tolerance, etc., maybe faith. The vision is basically the world you want to create in the context of whatever you're doing. So it might be a world without hunger, a world where there's free speech, a world of tolerance where all people are treated equally, etc. And the mission is, simply put, that which your organization is doing in order to achieve that vision. So your mission is much more measurable. Everything derives from your mission, your goals, your strategies, your objectives, etc. And then you need the ability to communicate that. You also need to plan for the future, have a sense of the future. You need to have a sense of what that future looks like, what success looks like. And therefore, if you have a sense of what success looks like, then you should have the ability to achieve that success and measure results. And I always believe that organizations ought to define their own success and then tell their funders what they believe are the appropriate measurements to achieve that success. You also need to be able to manage an informed and active and accountable governance structure. That's not the focus of today's webinar, but when one looks around and sees the kinds of problems, the kind of scandals, the kinds of things that reach the newspapers about nonprofits, it's often because of a failure of the board of directors or a failure of appropriate responsibility, division of responsibility between management and governance. Management is basically the staff, the executive director, whatever staff there may be, and governance is basically the board of directors. In an organization without staff, those functions still exist. They're a little harder to define. And then the organization needs to secure resources. And those resources are time, money, people, facility, whatever it may be, public reputation, credibility, whatever they may be. It's not just money. Whatever's necessary to achieve its desired outcome. And last, and very important, is that the organization needs to engage and serve its stakeholders and the community. And one needs to then go back and define who are the stakeholders. And we'll come back and look at that in a minute. This is some of the stuff that we do here at the Center for Nonprofit Studies. We offer a certificate in nonprofit leadership and management, which is about 9 months long. It meets one Friday and one Saturday a month. Great program. We're entering, next year will be our 10th year. We have 225 graduates. And at the end of this year, actually, we'll have over 240, 250 graduates. And a great program if you're serious about the nonprofit sector. Many people enter the sector from other arenas and therefore do not have a systematic and comprehensive understanding. As a matter of fact, most people in the nonprofit don't. They're focused on doing whatever it is that they do. And so we offer this certificate in nonprofit leadership and management. We have a grant writing certificate, which is a 1 week long program that actually is underway even as I speak. And folks write a grant as part of that. Several participants have actually written 6-digit grants and obtained them as a result of the program. We have one of the few programs in volunteer management in the state of Texas. We also do a lot of focus on social media, and so we have all kinds of programs on social media, including film. And then we have a series of what we call learning opportunities on a variety of subjects. If you aren't already connected, I urge you to go to our website, nonprofitaustin.org, and sign up for our newsletter. So the focus of my practice, and I've been involved in this arena for over 40 years, is the individual. And so I like to start off with this quote from Lao Tzu, who was a Chinese philosopher in the 2nd century of the Common Era, who said, if your life works, you influence your family. If your family works, your family influences the community. If the community works, your community influences the nation. If your nation works, your nation influences the world. And if the world works, the ripple effect spreads across throughout the cosmos. And I start off with this because it's so important to emphasize that whatever we do, we have a lot of power as individuals. And nonprofits are created, charities are created for causes, but it starts with individuals. And we as individuals are responsible. Many people have a rather pediatric perception of the nonprofit sector. They believe you takes the money, you takes the heart, you put them together, and voila, that's the nonprofit. You don't need to know much more except that. So basically, it's a lot more complex than that, as you probably know, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a model I've developed over the years. If we have time during this webinar, I'll come back and define this model because I think it could be helpful in your thinking through what you need to do in order to create the nonprofit and reply to the various requirements of the state and federal government. So now we get to what you thought you signed up for. So the process. First, you file a certificate of formation with the Secretary of State. That takes 48 hours if you have an account and do it online, and it will take a week or 10 days if you do it by mail. The cost for that is $25. We'll be talking about that in a little more detail. Then after actually the next part of the state would be that you would also, once you get your 501c status, which we'll talk about in a second, then you file for a franchise tax exemption. As soon as you're incorporated as a nonprofit in the state of Texas, then you will automatically be eligible for sales tax exemption. So when you buy items, you don't have to pay sales tax. There's a form that you obtain on the comptroller's website. We'll talk about it in a few minutes. And you simply hand that to the vendor, and as a result, the vendor submits it, and you will not pay sales tax. However, if you sell items, you do need to collect sales tax and submit it to the comptroller's office. After you create your certificate of formation, you would then want to get your employer's identification number, also called the EIN. Some people will call it the tax ID, nonprofit number, It's basically nothing more than a Social Security number that all nonprofits, all corporations have. You get it for free by going up to the IRS website, irs.org, irs.gov. Type in the search engine EIN online, and you can fill it out right then and there. It take about 10 minutes, maybe a few minutes longer if you're a slow typist. It asks you some information, everything of which you already know, and then at that point, it will give you a PDF online, which is your EIN number. You then take your EIN, plus what you'll get back from the Secretary of State, which will be a certificate of formation and a certificate of filing. You go to your bank and you open up a bank account. You're in business as far as the state of Texas is concerned. In order to meet the requirements of what's called the Texas Business Organization Code, which is the Texas law that regulates nonprofits, you need to have bylaws. We'll talk more about bylaws. Basically, for the moment, bylaws are a set of policies and procedures by which your organization will be governed. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. That completes the state process, and now we move on to the federal process, which included getting your EIN number. If you're applying for a 501c3, either an individual or a group exemption, you would then file the IRS 1023 form. There are two kinds. One is the EZ, which we'll talk about as well, and that is you're only eligible if your gross revenue over a period of 3 years averages less than $50,000 and you have less than $250,000 in assets. And then there's the traditional process, which takes longer and is more comprehensive, and we'll talk about that. In the EZ process, you'll receive word back from the IRS, usually within a month or 2 months. The process is an expedited process. On the traditional process, you'll hear back within 90 days from the IRS telling you they received your application. Thereupon, it's unlikely, although it's happened a few times, and I've incorporated dozens and dozens and dozens of these organizations. And if you need help, I do provide this as a private consulting service, if that's of interest to you. But it's very rare the IRS will accept the application and provide what's called a 501c3 determination right away. In most cases, they put it back in their system, and then you enter into what I call the IRS black hole, which is the time it sits in their computer system until it goes to the desk of one of the agents. At that point, the agent will contact you with any questions they may have. And at that point, they will send you their questions. They will give you 2 weeks to respond. If you want an extension, you simply ask for an extension. Then they will come back to you with more questions, or they will then make a determination. Based upon their initial questions, one can tell pretty much whether or not you're going to have a problem or not. So the goal here is to submit your application in such a way that you avoid the red flags, which we'll talk about, and you get it in as elegantly and simply as possible. The purpose is not to tell them everything about you and your organization. The purpose is to tell them the relevant information that they need to have in order to assess your application. And we'll talk about what that criteria is. Then you'll hear from them. You'll get your determination or whatever the outcome is. And then you're subject to state and federal reporting requirements. For the state, it's very simple. You file a public information report on an annual basis, which basically includes a list of your board of directors and their terms. And then for the federal government, you will file on an annual basis what's called the IRS 990 form, which is a federal information form that asks both budgetary, financial information, as well as information about your governance and your operations. So that's the timeline, and that's what we're going to focus on in a few minutes. In terms of basic background, when we look at the nonprofit sector, we look at it when we look at the United States, we look at it as made up of three sectors: the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector. Now, the nonprofit sector goes by a lot of names. It's called the independent sector, the third sector, the voluntary sector, the social sector, but mostly, in my mind, it's the invisible sector, because mostly people don't understand what we do in this sector, or they have some very, very simplistic views about what we do in this sector. The sector is basically governed by Chapter 22 of the Texas Business Organization Code, and I always encourage people to go up to the actually I think it's at the Secretary of State site or the Attorney General site, and read it. I'd be glad to send you a copy if you want to just email me. Basically, it's written in very clear language, and it basically defines what the state requires in terms of operating a nonprofit. Now, in terms of a nonprofit, one becomes a nonprofit by incorporating in the state, in this case, Texas. One gets its tax-exempt status, however, by becoming by applying to the Internal Revenue System, the federal government. As I'm sure everybody in this call knows, and if you don't, here's a surprise, we don't pay personal income tax in the state of Texas. If you've been paying, you ought to stop immediately. Basically, so therefore, if I make a contribution to an organization in the state of Texas, there's no Texas benefit per se. If I make a contribution to a 501c3, then I can take a deduction off of my taxes. They're tax deductible. Now, there are actually 28 types of tax-exempt entities, of which only the 501c3 is eligible. And when we talk about 501c3, we're talking about Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. There is also the two other most common entities are the 501c4, which is an organization to promote social welfare and advocacy. Those are the entities, you may recall, there was a big fuss in Congress that some organizations, some conservative groups thought they were there was prejudicial treatment towards them. Those are C4s. Now, C4s are tax exempt, they don't pay taxes, but if you give money to a C4, you do not get a tax deduction. Then there are C6s, and those are associations, and those organizations exist to benefit their members, like the Chamber of Commerce, like the Texas Association of Mexican Chambers of Commerce, etc. 501c3s exist to benefit the public, and that's why they're often called public charities. I'm going to go on to the key characteristics of nonprofits, and then I'm going to open up if there's any questions. What I'll do when I open up for questions, I'll count to 5 so everybody has a chance to ask their question, or if there's silence, and then we'll move on. So looking at nonprofits, a simplistic overview of the key characteristics, and these are things that you need to know when you're filling out your IRS 1023 form, is that the purpose of and everything from this point forward, I'm only speaking about 501c3s. The purpose of a 501c3 is to benefit the public. You cannot create a 501c3 to benefit an individual. It has to benefit the public, and that's critical. Ownership. There is no concept of ownership in the nonprofit world. There is no equity. When an organization ends its life, its assets will need to be transferred, if there are any, to another 501c3. The last person on the board does not get the assets. So there is no concept of equity. There's no concept of ownership, which leads us to the concept of control. Equity or ownership is replaced by the concept of control. The board of directors controls the nonprofit. They're the ones that are responsible for the oversight. They're responsible that the organization does that for which it was created to do under its certificate of formation and under the determination letter from the IRS. The next element is accountability. The nonprofit, 501c3 in the state of Texas, is accountable to the Internal Revenue Service for its 501c3 status, and in the state, it's accountable to the Attorney General and the Comptroller. And if there's a problem with it, the Attorney General has the authority to remove the board, close down the nonprofit. Usually it will not do that. Usually it will try to find some intermediary steps to resolve any kinds of conflicts or difficulties that the organization may have. And the last item is private inurement, which is a no-no. A private inurement is akin to getting insider training, personal benefit. The nonprofit exists to benefit the public, and it should not provide for the benefit to an individual. It should not benefit the board of directors members financially per se. You can hire an executive director. You who are forming the organization can be the executive director, and you can earn a salary. But you are not. But you're an employee of the organization, so that's not considered private inurement. 501c3s are organized for public purpose. We talked about that. They're independent of government and business. Nonprofits are not businesses. We are usually small employers, but we are not businesses. We do have business operations as part of what we do, but it's a grave error to think of us as businesses. We're self-governed by a board of directors. We'll come to that. Key characteristic, surplus revenue is not distributed as profits. It is put back in the organization and used for the continuation and the enhancement of the operations. Nonprofits should try to make profits, or what's called profits, which in our terms would be excess revenue, because one of the things we want to do is create an operating reserve so we have money in the bank for those rainy days. Contributions to a 501c3 are tax deductible, and again, that is not the case with any other kind of 501c entity. One of the ancillary benefits are people volunteer to help achieve the mission. There aren't a hell of a lot of people that volunteer for Walmart. They're governed by a diverse volunteer board of community members. How they get elected, what their responsibilities are, is a whole nother topic. Glad to answer any specific questions, but that really is the issue of governance. And if that's an issue, I encourage you to perhaps join in a webinar that I'll be doing on nonprofit governance, or join in one of our classes at the center. Nonprofits are driven by mission to benefit the public, and we're accountable to the public, not stockholders. The public is represented by the Attorney General and the Internal Revenue Service. So I'm going to unmute you all and count to 5 and give you an opportunity to ask any questions you may have of what we've covered to date. Any questions? Okay, I think you're unmuted. Is there anybody who has a question who's not being heard? Because I'm not hearing anything. Use the chat box. 1. Okay, thanks, Julie. No questions here. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we're putting you back on mute, and we'll continue. No, not that. Yeah, I'm afraid so. Okay. So one of the things that's important for you as you start out is to identify your stakeholders. And stakeholders are any individual or organization that has the power to influence your organization or who is strongly influenced by your organization. This will include your competitors, and yes, there is competition in the nonprofit world, extensive competition as a matter of fact. And so what you would do is you identify these folks, and then and here's an example of some: donors, your board of directors, your constituents, your staff. Again, you'd identify all these as part of a strategic planning or thinking process. Whoops, let's go back. And from this identification, you're also going to be able to identify who are the kinds of people you want to serve on your board of directors, who are the kinds of people you're going to turn to for financial assistance, who are going to be your supporters, who do you need to, in essence, build defenses against, who do you need to, use the word loosely, co-opt to get involved, who do you need to collaborate? Again, that gets into strategic thinking and planning. So one cannot create a 501c3 to support a needy individual. It has to be a cause. If you're doing it because you heard there's a lot of grant money available, I suggest you first check to make sure that the funds are there. There is a lot of grant money out there, but it may or may not be available for what you want. And if you think you're going to be able to do things your own way and be unfettered by rules or bureaucratic procedures, that may be true, but keep in mind that in running the nonprofit, if you're if you're the staff, that you will be subject to the board of directors in some fashion or another. So before you get started, you want to ask yourself a couple of key questions. Is the proposed project legal? So if you believe that medical marijuana should be distributed to people, you cannot, and you create a nonprofit to make medical marijuana available in the state of Texas, that's breaking the law. That would be illegal. Whether it's good or bad is another issue, whether it's helpful or unhelpful. So number one, as silly as it sounds, I get a lot of people coming to me with ideas that are just plain illegal. So it's got to be legal. Number two, is there a demonstrated need? Now, these are questions you want to ask yourself before you spend a lot of time investing in people, raising money, spending the money on this process, spending the time on this process, because these are not necessarily the questions IRS is going to ask you, because they're only concerned that you're serving the public or benefiting the public, but you're not going to be able to raise money, raise resources if what you're doing is not perceived as necessary by other folks. So is there a demonstrated need? What is it? Is your mission easily stated? Can you come in and tell me in a minute or two what your organization is about? I get folks all the time who come to visit me asking for help, and after a half hour of them telling me, sitting there and talking, my next question is, so what are you going to try to do? And this is particularly the case with religious groups, or that's one place where it happens a great deal, where one gets caught up in a lot of, quote, God talk and talking about faith and ideology and so forth. And so that's all fine, but bottom line is, what are you actually going to do? Is it possible to partner with somebody else? Have you gone out there and looked at what else is out there, which is due diligence? Have you checked to make sure that you're not duplicating something exactly? Can you describe what success looks like? Here, what I suggest is a very simple tool is just make believe it's 3 years into your organization's operation and sit down and put onto a piece of paper what's happening. So what's happening on November 10th, 2018 in your organization? And write it out. And then ask yourself, how did you get there? And we'll talk about that in terms of the model. But you ought to be able to describe what success looks like. It's really important to realize that people are moved by visions and dreams, not details. So you need to give me the dream. You've got to tell me what success looks like. You got to get me excited if you want my support. Which then moves on to the question, are there really others who will commit the time and resources to make this happen? This notion, build it and they will come, is a great idea, but it doesn't always work. And so you want to go out and ask people, if I do X, would you do Y? If I build this organization, will you support it? If the answer is yes, you don't have any certainty, but at least you know there's a possibility. If the answer is no, then you have certainty that that person will not support you. That's very important information. And do you and your supporters have the necessary information and understanding of how nonprofits are structured and how they function? If you don't, you ought to go out there and learn about it, or make sure there's at least one person on your board, or one person on your advisory council, or one person in your circle of folks that you're going to turn to for help over the years who does have that kind of awareness. In terms of self-interest questions, what are your control needs? Are you a control freak? Do you need to be in charge of everything? If that's the case, then you're going to have a lot of challenges in a nonprofit, because nonprofits at all levels operate through some degree of collaboration, some degree of trust. Being clear about why you're doing this. And if you're doing this in order to create a job for yourself, that's perfectly okay. But you ought to be honest about that. And keep in mind, once you create that job, you're going to be accountable to the board of directors. You will not be in control of the organization. No matter what, you will not have legal control. You should be able to influence the organization, but you will not have legal control of the organization. And another key question, which is in red because it's a very important one, is have you considered fiscal agency? Now, fiscal agency is a process by which your organization operates for some time, maybe forever, as part of another organization, and you, in essence, borrow that organization's 501c3 status, and therefore you have instant tax deduction. In fiscal agency, the fiscal agent will often charge the organization a sum of money for one of three things, or all three things. One, for the risk they're at because of your using their 501c3. Two, for any services they may provide, because you're operating as part of their organization, and as a result, you are part of them, and they usually will not allow you to write your own checks. And third, because nonprofits are always looking for revenue, and it's a revenue opportunity. Glad to talk more about fiscal agency if that's something of interest to anybody who's part of this webinar. The advantages of starting a 501c3: limited liability, structure, accountability, they're created in perpetuity unless you set it up for a specific time. So I incorporated the group that did the Vietnam War Memorial at the state capitol, and that was created for a period of time, not in perpetuity. It gives you a legally recognized entity, and in our country, where nonprofits get a lot of benefits, lower postal rates, access to the media, there's a presumption of credibility. Disadvantages: loss of control, there's regulation and paperwork, the time it takes to get underway. We're different than for-profits. One needs to understand that. There's a learning curve if you don't, and the board members have legal liability, all of which we'll talk about or will be talked about in other webinars, but for the moment, I raised those. So, again, I'm going to open up the opportunity for questions. Nobody has used the chat so far. Either this is so obvious and instructive or so boring. So I'm going to open up the opportunity for you to raise any questions you may have. Easier said than done. Okay, you all should have the opportunity to say anything you want. Any questions? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. My assumption is there's no questions, so we'll go back to muting you all. And here we go. Now we're going to talk about the process. So, basically, it's a dual process, as I mentioned before. It's regulated by the Business Organization Code. You apply for a certificate of formation, the sales and franchise tax exemption. We'll go talk about it. If you're selling goods, the sales tax license is important. And as we talked, you need to file an annual public information report. Very simple report. The annual franchise tax report, it's crossed off because while you need to file it, as soon as you get your 501c status, then you simply file a franchise tax exemption form. I'll show it to you in a few minutes, and you no longer have to worry about the franchise tax. On the federal side, you're subject to the Internal Revenue Code, the IRS code. You need to obtain your employer's identification number. You need to file your 1023, and on an annual basis, you need to file the appropriate version of the Form 990. In a later slide, you'll see which dollar limits require which forms. Failure to file the IRS 990 for 3 years in a row will lead to an automatic revocation, and then your filing is as if you're a brand new 501c3, and therefore you have to pay the fees and go through the same process and be subject to whatever new laws and no longer grandfathered in. So it's better not to lose your 501c3 status. I put this in as a sort of joke. This is the exempt organ. This is the process the IRS follows for you to get your status, but we're going to be much simpler. So let's go to the state side. This is a copy of the first page of the certificate of formation. And so you need to have a name. Your organization has to have 2 words different than any other name in the state of Texas. You're only worried about the state of Texas. The name cannot use the word veteran, cancer, bank in it without getting special permission. If you want to use the word bank, you have to go to the commissioner of insurance to get permission. That'll cost you $5. You need to have a registered agent. The registered agent is simply the individual who gets mailings from the Secretary of State or the Comptroller. It's really important that that individual be someone who is current. And so I always encourage people in their bylaws to include when they do elections, to include a provision that their registered agent is either reaffirmed or changed at that time. As a result, it's part of your ongoing organizational ritual and you don't forget about it. If you forget about it and somebody dies or somebody gets angry at you or somebody just moves and the Secretary of State sends their mailings and the person never receives them, then when they send the forfeiture of your corporate status, you'll never know it, and you can be put out of existence legally, which will then undermine your 501c3 status, which is based upon your being a Texas corporation. And so you don't want that to happen. You need 3 people to serve as the initial board of directors, and that is, and the state doesn't care who those 3 people are. Pardon me. But it's good not to have folks that are related in the first degree, mother, father, sister, brother, on that board initially or ever, because the IRS does require that they not have that relationship. Also, the state doesn't care, but the IRS is concerned if people have some business relationship under which one person can control or influence another person's vote. So that's an important point. It's best to just do it right on the state form, although the state doesn't tell you that because it's not a concern of the state. The next issue is members. Members are not people who pay you dues, but members are those legally defined as those who have the right to elect the board of directors. When I incorporate groups, I always encourage people to create a non-membership corporation unless their organization has an ideological desire for democracy with a small d. And I'm not talking about that being the opposite of dictatorship. but it's hard to pull diverse people together to deal with governance issues. So if you create a membership corporation, then those members govern the organization. They will then elect the board of directors, and they have the right to impeach the board of directors, and so forth. In a non-membership corporation, the board of directors is defined in the bylaws, in the certificate of formation, and those 3 or more people then will elect either themselves or others in the future, and the board becomes self-perpetuating. It's an easier way to run the organization. The next question, Article 5, actually, is going to be the purpose of the organization. Now, the Secretary of State and the state of Texas doesn't require anything more than a statement of what your purpose is. The IRS, however, requires reference to your being a 501c3. And if you're doing this yourself, then just email me and I'll send you the language you need to include there. If you don't include the language, then you're going to have to refile when you do the filing for the Internal Revenue Service, and it's going to cost you another $25. This form costs you $25. And then the state does not require any supplemental provisions, but the IRS prefers that you include a dissolution or termination clause. That's in Article 6. And so, again, if you're going to do this yourself, just send me an email, and I'm glad to send you the language for both the purpose clause and the termination clause. This filing will cost you $25, and as I said, it'll take 48 hours or 10 days, depending upon how you're going to proceed. This is what the form looks like for the exemption for the franchise tax exemption. It's very simple. As you can see, there aren't a lot of boxes. Let me go back a second. So when you get your certificate of formation back, the Secretary of State will send you back 2 documents. One is going to be this form, stamped right here in the right-hand corner with the date, and I think it includes your filing number. If not, your filing number is on your certificate of filing, which is the second document. And that's the information you're going to need for this form here. Again, it's very, very simple. You file this after you get your 501c3 determination. So let's leave it on the chat. Does anybody have any questions about the filing to become a nonprofit corporation in the Texas Nonprofit Corporation? Okay. Seeing no questions, we'll proceed. We talked before about, okay, we have a question here, I think. Julie, do you have a question? I've unmuted you, Julie. I think I have. Okay. Okay. Julie, let's talk. Yeah. Let's talk privately about that. You're talking about these organizations. If these organizations are all going to be operating under a, pardon the others, if you'll pardon me for a second as I respond to Julie's question, let me just read it to you all so you have a sense of it. On the certificate of formation form, she manages booster clubs. She's part of a school district who change offices frequently, and they never filed the certificate of formation. Should she go back and file the certificate of formation for all the booster clubs? The question is how they operate. The fact is right now, there's no legal entity for any of these booster clubs, I assume. So I would probably go back and have each one of them become a separate Texas nonprofit corporation, which would then require them to have bylaws and so forth. You can develop one set of bylaws and have them all use that, and that's how they would then determine how they change officers. Right now, it's probably very informal groups, and that creates all kinds of liability questions. So, Julie, I think it's best in terms of that kind of question for you and I to chat offline of this, because that's going to raise a lot of other questions that may or may not be of interest to the other folks on the webinar. So I'm more than glad for you to call me. I'm going to type in my phone number here, which I think is on the materials anyway, for all of you. Whoops. Of course, if I could type, that would be good. So that my number is 512-223-7076. Whoops, got to send it to you, and we can talk more. So basically, as I said, for the EIN number, go to irs.gov. I'm not sure if that URL works anymore, but in the search engine, just type in EIN online. Bylaws. So bylaws are policies and procedures adopted by the corporation for the regulation and management of its affairs. It deals with the kinds of issues that you see here. We don't need to go through all of them, but these are the kinds of things that are required, and this is what allows to ensure that the board controls the organization. We'll discuss it more if there's any questions. For right now, I'll skip it. And then the organization would hold its first organizational meeting after it's incorporated. And what it would do at that point is adopt the bylaws. Now, when I say the organization consists at this point only of the people whose names appear on the certificate of formation. They control this corporation. They come together, they adopt bylaws. These bylaws will then instruct them on how they're to proceed, what the terms of office are, if there are term limits or there aren't term limits, how you notify people, what each officer's responsibilities are, etc. So once these three or more people, whoever's identified in the certificate of formation, adopts the bylaws, they would then elect the board of directors and the officers being simply members of the board that have specific responsibilities. It could, if you have a small board, then every board member becomes an officer. Any person can be serve in more than one officer role, but the president and the secretary need to be separate people. So you can have a president-treasurer, you can have a vice-president-treasurer, a vice-president-secretary, a secretary-treasurer, but you can't have a president-secretary. Now, at this point, they can elect themselves, or they elect new people. And this is the transfer of authority and responsibility and control of the corporation. And from that point forward, whatever the provisions in the bylaws are the provisions that will then determine how the organization or who the officers are. You adopt the schedule of meetings, you approve the registered agent, et cetera, at your first meeting. And this is an example of an agenda for the first meeting. Now we approach the dreaded IRS Form 1023. It requires a basic familiarity with how nonprofits are structured and function. Believe it or not, I've just given you a good deal of that for what you need for the IRS. You need to be able to present your planned activities in the budget, whether you use somebody's services, mine or anybody else's, or you do it yourself. Those are the two things that only you can provide: what your narrative is, what you plan to do, how you're going to do it. You need to be very clear on who controls the 501c3, which is the board, not the staff. You need to be clear on what constitutes a conflict of interest. In other words, the IRS does not want first-degree relatives on the same board, and it does not want, for the reasons we talked about before, people who have more than a 30% interest in a business together on the same board. You can allow for that, but then you have to increase your size of the board. So if I wanted my brother to serve on the board, and I served on the board, then we'd need a minimum of 5 people on the board rather than 3, so that my brother and I could be outvoted. The legal assumption is that first-degree relatives or people with similar business interests or somebody who's in a hierarchical relationship, if my employee is on the board, then the assumption is that I can control my employee's vote, and therefore my employee is not independent. So I think that's clear. If it's not, ask me some more questions. And then you need to determine if the full or the EZ process is best for you, both in the short term and the long term. So in terms of filing the forms, everybody needs to file the form. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and other houses of worship don't necessarily, and organizations with gross revenues under $5,000, that should be $1,000, don't need to file the form. However, I always recommend you go through the process, because when people say, are you a 501c3? And then they start checking and they don't see you because you haven't filed, because you didn't have to file, let's say, the public won't understand that. So I encourage people to do it for the credibility purposes of if nothing else. You can read this on your own. Let's not worry about that. Let's skip these organizational tests, private inurement, a little more detailed than we need at the moment. Let's jump to the 1023 EZ. Is it an escape or a trap? Okay, so it's a simplified process. It's only 3 pages versus 12 pages. Basically, the IRS does not require you to submit copies of your bylaws, your budget, your narrative, or some of the other things that the 1023 traditional process requires. However, you will be attesting to the fact that you have all of these, and therefore, if you lie and you don't have them, and there's a way, and if any reason they find out, then you're engaging in perjury, which is kind of serious stuff. Pardon the terms, but you don't screw around with the federal government. That's where Alcatraz, which is no longer operational, but that's where the federal prisons come into play. Also be aware that both the 1023 EZ and the 1023 forms are open to public inspection. The 1023 EZ has a $400 user fee versus the $400 or $850 for the 1023 traditional process. We'll talk about traditional process. In order to do the 1023 EZ, you need to certify these 3 elements that are mentioned here. You need to provide the names and addresses of your officers, that you'll not engage in prohibited activities, and so forth. Basically, there is a worksheet that you go through to make sure that you qualify. You're not eligible to file the IRS Form 1023 if you have total assets greater than $50,000, than $250,000. If your annual gross receipts revenue is more than $50,000 per average in a 3-year basis. If you're a foreign organization, if you have ties with terrorism, like you're going to admit it on the form, if you're a limited liability corporation, or if you're a successor to a for-profit organization. So while it's simpler, it's more difficult. It requires, pardon me, while it's simpler, it requires a narrower group of people that can file. And this just tells you other entities that are not eligible. So now look at the 1023 traditional process. Again, I'm giving you the URLs where you can find the form and the instructions. The instructions are rather complete. People get scared about it, and it is really not that scary once you know what they're asking. So, as I said, there's extensive instructions. You need an addendum. They ask you questions. There's not enough space to fill out the answers. So every single page you submit should have your name of the organization and the EIN on every page. When you do the form itself, starting on page 2, you will have the a space on top where you put the name of the organization and the EIN, and it will self-populate. Be consistent in your information. Basically, if you tell me you have a website, then you probably have a cost for a website, and so forth. And pay attention to details. Fill in every question. If the answer is not applicable, then put N/A, NA, whatever you want to do. So if we look, for example, on the organization website, where my arrow is right now, you may or may not have a website. You may or may not have an email. Even though it says optional, I'd put N/A. This question 11, the date incorporated, that's the date that your certificate of formation states as your date of incorporation. Now here's the important thing to keep in mind, that when you apply that you have 27 months from the date of incorporation until you apply for the 501c3. You can apply anytime, but if you apply within 27 months, then at the time you get your determination, it's retroactive to the date you were incorporated. So if you're serious about incorporating, I urge people to incorporate right away as soon as they're ready to move forward. Because, again, when you get the final word from the IRS, it'll be retroactive to that date. And that way, when you put money into the organization after it's been incorporated, you can transform that into a tax deduction later on. Any money you use before this is incorporated will not be tax deductible. Okay? So that's important and depends upon, how much money you may be putting into that. Now I'm going to deal with the highlights because some of the questions are pretty obvious. Now, when I do this for folks, I have what I call a consolidated form. I ask you a bunch of questions. Once you give me the answers, I'm in the position to basically complete most of the forms for you. And there are a number of red flags. So let me address the red flags at this point. One, and red flags is not bad. It's just issues that will get the IRS's attention and which you, the submitter, would want to include more information. So one, if you're operating outside the United States, in a foreign land, in any way, then the IRS and the government is concerned about narco-terrorism. And therefore, you'd want to show that you have complete control over the funds, both transferred to that country as well as any funds that organization may send to you or that country may send to you, so there's no laundering of funds, etc. So if anybody has that issue, we can talk more about that. It happens rarely that somebody is doing that, or there aren't that many usually on these calls, these webinars. But if there is, then we can talk about that. So if somebody is planning to operate in a foreign country, please just send me a chat. Let me know what your purpose is and what you're going to do real quick, and I'll pick up and talk about that. Or again, feel free to call me, after this webinar. I'd be glad to answer any questions. The second area is if you're giving scholarships or grants, you're giving money away, which is very common. There, it's always good to include the criteria that for your grants or scholarship, a copy of the form you're going to use, and so forth. So you really want to move into that mode I suggested earlier, that you make believe it's 3 years from now and everything is going the way you want it to go. What's going on? What are the forms you're using? What are the criteria you're using? How are you making decisions? Is it the board? Is it a committee? Etc. Because one of the IRS's concerns is nepotism and self-inurement, that you may be creating this organization in order to fund your own kids, your friends' kids, your relatives, etc. So the IRS is dealing in general, and these are the concerns that result in conflict, and these are conflicts of interest, clearly. So the IRS will have asked you along the lines, do you have a conflict of interest policy? So in terms of the narrative, this is my language, to use. You can read it at your leisure, and this is what the IRS asks you. So basically, you don't need to answer each and every question individually. You can just write a little essay, a little narrative that says that we're going to do A, B, and C. we're going to employ X, Y, and Z people. This is what the impact's going to be. If you already have, quote, a business plan or some document that describes what you're all about, feel free to use that. But these are the kinds of questions the IRS wants. And the bottom line of all of this is to make sure that the principles that I talked about before, underlining or under the foundations of nonprofits, are being carried out in your organization, that you're doing things that are indeed for the benefit of the public. Part 5 is going to ask you about compensation, about family or business relationships. We talked about that. They're going to ask you about how you establish your compensation policy, and the right answer is that you do it by benchmarking. They're going to ask you if you have a conflict of interest policy. The right answer is yes, and you ought to have one. If you don't have one in your bylaws, then you would want to, I suggest you look at the one the IRS recommends as one of the addendum on the 1023 traditional process instruction forms. There's a sample. What's critical here is, in general, you should never adopt any policy or sign any document that has any words there or concepts you don't understand. So the IRS policy is rather comprehensive. Once you adopt the policy as an organization, then you are accountable for carrying out that. So you always want to be very, very careful. The IRS is going to ask whether you're purchasing goods, services from officers, directors, or employees. Again, that conflict of interest, that self-interest issue. Similarly, with regard to leases and contracts, so you would want to attach any significant contracts or leases that are essential to the organization's operations. Example, I've incorporated a number of equine therapy groups in which the executive director is the owner of the property on which this takes place. And so the organization enters into a contract with or lease with the owners of the property, which happens to be the executive director is the same person, but she's operating as two different people in that she's going to sign a contract with herself. But again, it's really not herself because she signs the contract on behalf of the organization, not on behalf of herself. Excuse me. Hopefully that makes sense. Part 6 is going to ask you who the services are being provided to. Are you any restrictions? Again, these questions are all going to relate to that private inurement personal benefit question. Part 7 is going to ask you, are you a successor organization or another organization? Are you filing more than 27 months after incorporation? If you are, and I've explained that before, then basically there's a form, a schedule you complete, and unless you have a real good excuse, it basically can tell you at the end of the form that your exemption will be retroactive to the date of your filing of the 1023 if it's 27 months after incorporation. On many of these parts, there are schedules that you need to complete. If, for example, if you're offering scholarships, if you're an educational institution, etc. When you submit your forms to the IRS, you only submit the schedules that you're actually using. So your form is 12 pages normally if you have no schedules, and then there's an additional 2 pages, which is a checklist, which you put in front of your form. Part 8 deals with specific activities. I ask you, are you supporting political campaigns, influencing legislation? And this is not the time to get into it, but you can actually engage in lobbying or advocacy. It's limited, and there are forms you fill out. If that's an issue for anybody, you can raise it. We can discuss it. They'll ask you your fundraising sources, plans, and geographic reach. So, where are you going to get money from? Are you going to get grants? Are you going to get individual donations? Are you going to do emails? Are you going to get it from your website, other people's websites, etc.? And there's a checkoff. If there's other places, you indicate those as well. What is your fundraising plans? I usually simply put, we're going to raise our money through emails, public events, etc., etc. In Central Texas, in the state of Texas, throughout the United States, in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, whatever it may be, just put that down. If you're doing a joint venture with a for-profit, then you'll answer that question. There's another form to be complete. Nonprofits cannot benefit for-profits. Charitable dollars can only benefit a charitable entity. So on the question of intellectual property, for example, if you do have intellectual property in your organization, curricula, software, whatever, methodologies, then the correct answer to the question is any intellectual property that is developed using charitable dollars or the organization pays for belongs to the organization, and it doesn't belong to the individual who developed it. It's like patents at a university. If you're working for the university and you develop and you get a patent, the university owns the patent. There's ways to get around that, such as the individual licensing the intellectual property to the organization. But in that case, that needs to be stated right up front, and the person needs to do it on their own time, not the organization's time. Once dollars are charitable, they can only be used for charitable purposes. So a nonprofit cannot be used to benefit a for-profit. So a nonprofit can't advertise a for-profit except to say we thank them for supporting this organization. Or it could create a shopping directory, etc. But it shouldn't be endorsing a for-profit. A for-profit, however, can benefit a nonprofit. So a for-profit can benefit a nonprofit in any way you want. They can endorse them, they can give you money, etc. The next question is acceptance of real estate, autos, and boats. Now this used to be a scam many years ago, and the scam basically was I would give you my clunker. I wouldn't indicate, it didn't have an engine. The blue book would tell me it's worth X. I would then take X off my taxes. Nowadays, or the organization would send me a letter saying that it was worth X based upon the blue book value. Under current regulations and processes, you as the organization, when you accept any real property, you would simply advise the donor that thank you for your 1960 Skylark, Buick Skylark, etc. And it's your responsibility to determine the costs. So the determination of the tax-deductible amount rests with the donor, not with the organization. You never want to give them a dollar amount, except in one case, and that is if you actually sell that item, then you should and could, and your donor would appreciate, you're sending them a note, a letter saying that your 60 Skylark, Buick Skylark was sold at auction, for which we received $1,000. And then the donor can use that as a basis for their tax deduction. Part 8 deals with operating outside the U.S. in foreign countries. We already talked about this before. Part 9 is going to ask you for a budget. And basically, this what's here, and you can read at your leisure because you'll have the handouts. What here tells you how much information is required based upon how long your organization is in existence. Frankly, I don't understand, and I've been doing this for 40 years. I don't understand the IRS form. I say that tongue-in-cheek. But all you need to do is simply provide a form that shows, except you need to do it correctly. I see that I have the year 2105. It should be 2015. You have your chart of accounts, your revenue and your expenses, and then you have whatever they are for 3 years, 4 years, your actuals if you've already been in existence, and then basically you total them up and attach this as an addendum. So you don't need to use the Form 9A. However, Form 9B is your balance sheet. And a balance sheet is basically a picture of where your organization is at a particular time. In this case, it's as of the last day of your fiscal year, your last fiscal year. If you're starting out brand new, then you'd have zeros listed throughout. And you will have identified on the first page of the form what your fiscal year is, the financial year into which you're operating. So if your fiscal year is a calendar year, then that would be January 1 to December 31. And your IRS 990 would be due 5 months and 15 days after that. It would be due May 15th. If you're the federal year, I believe that starts October 1 through September 31st or September 30th. Either way, in terms of your budget, you can keep it nice and simple if you'd like. Part 10 asks you your public charity status. If you're going to be a foundation, you need to provide some further information. And it asks you what type of nonprofit you are, and that's going to be based on where your revenue comes from. There's an element that asks you about an advance ruling that no longer exists. You just skip that. And I believe on the new forms you'll find online, it even tells you to do that. It still boggles my mind that it just don't remove it from the form, but that's what's up there. If you have to fill out a schedule, those are the schedules. New fees. And again, I think they have an overlay right now on the form. If your budget, average budget revenue, is $10,000 or more on the average of 3 years, then your filing fee for the traditional process is $850. If it's under $10,000, your filing fee is $400. An authorized person would sign the 1023. It needs to be one of the officers. So if you're going to be the executive director and you're not one of the officers, you can't sign it. It needs to be one of the officers. The fee is made out to the United States Treasury, not the Internal Revenue Service. Again, you screw that up. Sometimes they'll send it back to you. Sometimes they won't. As I said, the federal government requires the 990 5 months and 15 days after the end of the fiscal year. And you'll see on this, which you have, what's required. So if it's under $50,000, you basically file a postcard, and you see the other elements there. This is what the email looks like, or the letter looks like. Letter looks like when you get this after you submit it to the IRS, telling you that they've received it. This is basically part of the letter that says you've gotten your 501c3 status, success. I provided you here with a number of places to look for various information to save you time in operating, some publications. And if you have any other questions with the process, feel free to call me. And as I said, we both offer classes at the Austin Community College Center for Nonprofit Studies, classes that are focused on helping improve performance and helping people be successful in running nonprofits or being effective. And then separate from that, on a private basis, I do consulting, which includes helping people incorporate and so forth. So if the question relates to how to do it, then we'll answer that through the center. If it involves assistance in doing it, then because of liability issues, the college doesn't like us doing it under the college. I will do that privately. So that is basically the presentation. I'm not sure how long it's taken us. Whoops. Let's get back to the slideshow. So are there any questions? Whoops. Let me unmute you guys. Any questions?
Yeah, this is Deborah Levy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I just wondered, are there special considerations if you're going to be doing grant making?
Yeah, what you want to do is, well, the grant making, you definitely want the 501c3.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and you want to be clear about what your terms are, what your criteria are when you make those grants.
Okay.
So
is there a starting amount of money that you start with, or there monetary?
no, it doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's the principle.
All right. Thank you.
The more detail you can provide without getting obsessive, the better you are. One thing to keep in mind is that too much information can get you in trouble also.
Right.
And you also want to make sure that your website, basically reflects you're serving the public. So if you have a website right now, you may want to go clean it up before you submit it,
Okay.
your application, because anything in the public realm, the agent can go and look at.
Okay.
And some of this is the luck of the draw. What agent you get. You're dealing with a human being on the other side, so the more interesting you can make your application, the easier to read. Like anything, you make his job easier or her job easier, they'll be more likely to, have a favorable decision.
Okay. Okay, great. It's helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, I just want to remind you all that you have no other questions. It means you're going to have to go back to work. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. If you do, feel free to call me. It's been a pleasure doing this, and if we can be of any help at the center, please feel free to call on us.
Right, definitely. Thanks so much.
You all take care.
Bye-bye.